Our first talk is going to be given by Marie Casillas.
Thanks very much, Kenny. Okay, so I am presenting today on behalf of Ruthe Foushee, this brilliant individual who was not able to make it today. I'd also like to point you to Dan Byrne, who's one of our other co-authors, and Susan Golden Meadow and I are the lucky people who get to work with these two individuals on this project. That's also to say that I will do my very best to answer whatever questions you have, but I may end up deferring to Ruthe or Dan at a later date if there's something specific you want to know that I don't know. But let me just get into it. Okay, so in this talk, and I guess also just more generally, we are interested in spontaneous language use, particularly in conversation. Because there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on in conversation, not just in terms of the linguistic representations, but actually in the social aspects of interaction and the psycholinguistics of how people come to act in similar ways across interaction. And by that, I mean things like interactive alignment. So I'll get into that a little bit more. But just to take two simple examples of this kind of phenomena. So over the course of a conversation, two people in their vowels, for example, may become more similar, or maybe over a longer time scale, two people over the course of a year in being roommates may become more similar in the way that they talk, right? So when we're talking about alignment, that's related to ideas of things like accommodation and priming, which is what we'll get to in a second. Okay. The other reason why we're particularly interested in verbal interaction and dialogue is because it is at the heart of language development. Children learn language in the context of interacting with others. And we know from lots of research that I won't even try to summarize here that contingency is an important factor in understanding how language development takes place. When we try and look at how contingency impacts language learning specifically, we know a little bit actually about how it impacts referential word learning, but a lot less about how it affects other aspects of children's wide world of linguistic development. And when we try and think about how contingency could interact with some of those things, priming is an interesting way in. So for example, if we're trying to think about how children learn how to put words together or how to inflect words, becoming primed by the speech that's around them in interaction is a promising avenue for doing that. All right, so just to give you an example of a kind of naturally occurring case of this, this is an example of Shan speaking with her father. She's 2 years, 2 months. And I've got a gloss in English here for you. But you can see, for example, in the first two lines, Shan says, sha gu, right, fell off the shirt. And the father repeats the same exact form with a little bit of an inflectional change. And then later on, we've got ya ho, right? I'll toast it. This has got here both the aspect marker ya as well as the verb form. Repetition in Celtal is a particular quality of the way that both adults and children use language. Do not think that these are like implicit embedded corrections. This is actually what adults do as well. But this is just one example to show you how these are pervasive across different linguistic and cultural contexts in the kinds of language that children encounter in their everyday lives. So all of that together brings us to the one most famous model of this kind of work in psycholinguistics, the interactive alignment model. If you know anything about this topic, I'm sure you're familiar with this model by Pickering and Garrett. And our shorthand for it is this. And in this case, what happens is people kind of enter this alignment by ending up with similar situation models, which involves aligning these various other levels of representation, including semantics, syntactics, phonology, phonology and phonetics, as well as their lexical representations. And it relies on a few assumptions, right? So that there is parity between representations that are used by the individuals in both production and comprehension, that this kind of alignment between the individuals and across levels comes via automatic and resource-free priming, and that alignment at one level leads to alignment at another level. Okay, so you may be familiar with this model. Something that we're trying to introduce here in this paper is that there are some interesting predictions that it makes that, to our knowledge, haven't really been tested as thoroughly as they could. So the first one is that alignment between interlocutors should be correlated. That is, the extent to which interlocutors are aligning with each other should be correlated. The second is that we should have alignment within individuals should be correlated across levels of linguistic representation, right? So we're looking at alignment this way and also alignment this way in the model. And last but not least, that alignment should be influenced by the sharedness or strength of the interlocutor's linguistic representations. And this is really more of a developmental spin that we're putting on this model, where we're thinking of potential for alignment being constrained by how much representational overlap the interlocutors actually have. Okay, so the goals in this particular work are threefold. First, to test these basic predictions that we've just pulled out. And that's going to require us to quantify the alignment that we're seeing at a couple different levels of linguistic structure. The second is to examine alignment variability. So we know not everyone aligns in exactly the same way in exactly every interaction. So we're going to look across age for child-parent dyads, and we're going to look at two populations of children who have a lot in common, but the critical difference is one of them is typically developing, and the other has some kind of perinatal unilateral brain injury. And the third one that we're going to look at is whether caregiver alignment actually predicts language outcomes. So we'll just go over this. I know we have a limited amount of time and I'd like to get into it. All right, the resource that we're going to use to test these three things is the Language Development Project. This is a very unique corpus with longitudinal data from 14 months to 58 months that we can look at for this purpose. In fact, it goes with children all the way up through adulthood for some measures. It's all US English, families from the Chicagoland area. And as you can see from the summaries here, there's a lot of speech in the transcripts from these data. And like I said, there are a bunch of children who are typically developing and a whole bunch of children who have some kind of unilateral perinatal brain injury. And so, yeah, there's a whole variety of different types of data that's been collected with these kids starting at 14 months. We're going to be focusing on transcripts from home visits that are video recorded that are 90 minutes and coded for speech and gesture. And we're also going to make some links to those children's PPVT, which is essentially a vocabulary measure, a receptive vocabulary measure where children point to words that they hear. Oh, and I just want to mention before I go on that work along these lines has been done on this corpus before, but we're doing it in a little bit of a different way. If you're interested, though, I highly recommend you check out these two papers. Okay. So when we compute alignment, right, there are two interlocutors in the situation we're interested in. There's a child and a parent, and we compute alignment in two directions from one turn at talk to the next. So it can either be the parent responding to something the child said and aligning with the child's prior utterance, or the child responding to something that the parent said and aligning to what the parent just said, right? And we said we wanted to do it multiple levels. So what we've chosen for now are of what we can do with transcripts, basically, the lexical level, the syntactic level, and the semantic level. And there are a couple of other colleagues who have been looking at these different levels in a similar way. One thing that we tried really hard to do here, and great thanks to Dan Byrne for working through different possibilities for this, is to try and get a measure of syntactic alignment that's independent from lexical alignment. So I've summarized here a little bit in detail what we've done, but I'll be super brief about this. Basically, the lexical measure is what is a normalized measure of the shared words in between two utterances. These are lemmatized words. The syntactic level is basically we made a best guess automatically at a syntactic tree, and then we characterized that syntactic tree by a bunch of features and compared how closely those features align between trees. And the third one was we used an existing pre-trained word vector network to estimate how close in a big, multi-dimensional space two words are to each other. And then on average, how close two utterances are to each other to get three different levels of alignment. Okay, and like I said, this is continuous interaction, right? So for each utterance, that is a transition from one speaker to the next, we can compute all three of these measures, right? So like that dog's tail gets compared to another one. Okay, so let's go to some results. Now, this is the basic mean alignment across dyads for all levels, but to remind you of our three particular questions, is to look at alignment on these different levels of structure, to examine age and group-based changes, and to look at predictions for outcomes. So very briefly, we predicted that alignment between interlocutors should be correlated and within interlocutors should be correlated. But the evidence for between interlocutors is really only strong for semantic alignment. There is a little bit of evidence that the other two, particularly syntactic alignment, seems to come on a little bit later. But for lexical alignment, it's almost nothing. For alignment within individuals, we see stronger effects for parents than for children. When we look across age and different levels, we see actually quite similar types of effects between the children who are typically developing here on the top compared to children who have perinatal brain injury on the bottom. But as you can see, overall, parents are doing more alignment from their kids early on with a lot of convergence as they get a little bit older. And the third one was, does caregiver alignment predict future vocabulary? So here we're taking that vocabulary measure, and then we're looking at the section prior to that to see how in a regression model, how it predicts children's vocabulary at the next point. What we see is a little bit of a different finding for typically developing versus children with brain injury, that only, again, semantic alignment is showing up as a relevant predictor of later child PPVT, the vocabulary score. For children with brain injury, we're not seeing any kind of relationship between caregiver alignment, behavior, and their later on vocabulary. Okay, so I ran through that very quickly. There's a lot of results. I even have more in other slides that I haven't shown you yet, but let me give you the overall summary. We tested these predictions that seemed to us fairly obvious from the interactive alignment model, and we found inconsistent reports. The strongest support came from semantic alignment. So there might be something interesting there to think about with respect to how these nodes actually interact with what's going on in real-time communication. We found higher correlations within caregivers' levels of linguistic alignment than children's. And that is consistent with the strength of linguistic representation story, because they'll have stronger linguistic representations than their children do. And that the correlations between interlocutors at different levels is variable, like I mentioned, right? So semantic is the one that's robustly positive. All of this, we also wanted to point out, is made possible by this measure of syntactic alignment that is independent of lexical alignment. So that's going to be a little bit different to what we've been looking at in the past, but we're still not sure it's exactly right. We've tried to make a move toward more psychological plausibility, but that's certainly not at all guaranteed with our newest measure. So we're still kind of looking out there to figure out how we can improve a little bit further on this. So a couple of discussion points, or maybe just takeaways to think about, because we're still working through what all of this could mean and how it reflects on development and what interaction does for language development, is that first of all, we saw that by far and large, the syntactic alignment factor was the one that predicted child vocabulary. But we're trying to still work out, why is this? What is this semantic alignment predicting actually? What is it indexing? What is it doing there actually? Because it can come from a lot of different sources when you start thinking about it. Second, what is the appropriate baseline for linguistic alignment? Here we've shown you parents compared to their own children across different ages and between these two groups, but it's hard to know what kind of adult-like would be in this context. And third of all, we are interested in disentangling a lack of alignment from things like not having a sophisticated set of linguistic representations from not, for example, having a mature socio-interactional competence yet. There are a lot of different factors that play into here. If you say that children are doing less alignment than their parents, we could think of at least these two reasons for which that might be happening. So with that, I will just say thank you to Christy Schoenwald and Mark Theophile, our collaborators, Susan Levine, Lindsay Richland, Stephen Rodenbush, and Rebecca Foushee. the LDP RAs who are actually working hard to timestamp these utterances. We've just done them by sequence in the transcripts, but timestamping will make them infinitely more usable, as well as the funders for this project. So thanks very much.
Hi. Hi, thank you. Very, very interesting work. I have two questions. One is like you said that you were measuring semantic alignment using kind of word vectors or word embeddings. Are these static or like how do you do it? Because you want to measure the whole sentence, right?
We do. I think it might be the average over the sentence.
Okay.
That's one that I will actually have to get the details from Dan, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just FYI, there's like new models like BERT in computational linguistics that provide a kind of summary representation of a whole sentence. If you want, we can chat later. I know.
Yeah,
maybe you're aware of
absolutely.
it, but if not, yeah. Okay, that's one thing. And the other thing is whether you could repeat, because I didn't quite understand what you meant by within alignment, within speaker alignment versus between. So if you could just. Yeah.
Sure. So the level.
Thank you.
Yeah. That was just relative to their kind of across these different levels, lexical, syntactic, semantic, how correlated they were with themselves relative to the others, right? Yeah. And if I misunderstand that, then I won't answer it correctly, but.
I also had a question about the semantic alignment.
Yeah.
So that was very high. I wondered how you baseline that, like how you control for the fact that if we're talking about a particular topic, then even if we're just having a coherent discourse, the semantics should be somewhat aligned over time.
Yeah, exactly. I think there are a couple of ways in which this can get really tricky. One of the other groups that's been working on this has dealt with some of the source of why it can appear very high because of repetitions, which is something I showed you early on. Repetitions are ubiquitous in conversation, and you can deal with it in different ways. You can take out, for example, immediate direct repetitions, because those are guaranteed to have perfect alignment, but you can argue that they're doing something different interactionally, or you can kind of lump them in all together with the group. And we have done that here. And I can't remember exactly, but I do remember there being some, not necessarily normal distributional features because of this exact phenomena. So I think it is something for us to continue to think about and be inspired by this other work by people like Ruthe Foushee and Ruthe Foushee, who are working on these similar topics.
We have time for another question.
For someone online, maybe? Or if Ruthie's online, any correction? Yeah, okay. Thank you.